Marcus and Alicia had been dreaming of owning a house for many years. They had worked hard, saved every little bit, and finally, after searching for months, they found a beautiful home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The street was lined with tall trees, and the houses looked neat and welcoming. For them, it was more than just a house. It was the start of a new chapter, a place where they hoped to build memories, invite family and friends, and one day raise children. When they first moved in, Marcus smiled as he carried boxes inside, and Alicia waved to a few neighbors she saw walking by. Some smiled politely, others only gave a quick nod, but one man stood out. He was in his late 50s, gray-haired, with a sharp look in his eyes. His name was Mr. Thompson. Unlike the others, he did not smile back or even nod. Instead, he just stood on his porch, watching them closely, as if trying to measure every move they made. Marcus noticed it but brushed it off. "Maybe he's just curious," he told Alicia. She agreed and said, "Give it time. Once people get to know us, they'll see we're just like anyone else." The couple believed in kindness. They believed that if they showed respect to their neighbors, respect would return to them. But Thompson didn't share that view. From the very first day, he felt uneasy about Marcus and Alicia moving in. He had lived in that neighborhood for decades, and in his mind, he wanted it to stay a certain way. When he saw the young couple, instead of welcoming them, he convinced himself they didn't belong. His thoughts grew heavier every time he saw them smile, laugh, or carry something new into their home. A week later, Marcus and Alicia decided to host a small barbecue in their backyard to celebrate their new home. They invited family and a few friends. The smell of grilled food filled the air, and the sound of laughter made the evening warm and joyful. Children played in the yard, while adults shared stories around the table. For Marcus and Alicia, it was everything they had hoped for: family, togetherness, and happiness. But from his porch, Thompson frowned. He muttered under his breath about too much noise and shook his head at every burst of laughter he heard. He thought to himself that this wasn't the way the neighborhood should be. Instead of appreciating the joyful evening, he treated it as if it were trouble. The next morning, Thompson complained to one of the other neighbors, saying, "They had people over last night. Loud music, too much noise. I hope this doesn't become a habit." The neighbor shrugged and said, "It was just a family gathering. Nothing wrong with that." But Thompson wasn't satisfied. He kept repeating his thoughts, almost convincing himself that Marcus and Alicia were going to be a problem. Marcus and Alicia, however, remained kind and respectful. Every morning, Alicia would wave at neighbors on her way to work, and Marcus would greet people while watering the lawn. They tried to show warmth and friendliness. Some neighbors warmed up to them, but Thompson only grew colder. He started watching them more often. If Marcus worked on the car in the driveway, Thompson would peek out through the blinds. If Alicia carried groceries, Thompson would stand on his porch and stare. His suspicion wasn't based on anything real. It was based on his own thoughts, his own unwillingness to see the couple for who they were. One evening, Marcus came home later than usual from work. He had stopped by a furniture store and bought a few new chairs and a coffee table. It was already dark, but Marcus didn't want to leave them in the car overnight. He started unloading them, carrying them into the house piece by piece. Alicia was inside, organizing the living room, making space for the new furniture. As Marcus lifted a chair from the car, Thompson's eyes narrowed. From his porch, he whispered, "What are they doing out there so late?" He didn't see furniture being moved in. In his mind, he twisted the picture into something suspicious. He thought, why would anyone move things at night? Maybe they're up to something. Instead of walking over and asking politely, or even just letting it be, Thompson's irritation pushed him to do something else. He picked up his phone and called the police. With a stern voice, he said, "There are suspicious people moving items into a house at night." I think something's not right. You should send someone. Back inside, Marcus carried the last piece in and smiled at Alicia. That's it? We'll set them up tomorrow, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. But just as he was closing the front door, he noticed flashing lights outside. 2 police cars pulled up, and officers stepped out, shining their flashlights across the yard. Marcus froze for a moment, confused. He had done nothing wrong, yet here were police officers in front of his house. He stepped outside slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Evening, officers," he said calmly. "Can I help you?" One of the officers asked. "We received a call about suspicious activity." "Are you the homeowner?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, I am. My name is Marcus. I live here with my wife. We were just moving some furniture inside." At that moment, Alicia came to the door, her face showing shock and disbelief. She looked at the flashing lights, the officers, and then at her husband. "What's going on?" she asked softly. Marcus explained, "They got a call about us moving things." The officers looked at each other, unsure. They asked Marcus to show proof of residence. Marcus went inside, returned with his ID, and handed it to them. They checked it against the address. Everything matched. Still, the tension lingered. Across the street, Thompson stood proudly on his porch, arms crossed, whispering to himself, "I knew it. I knew something was off." He thought he had done the right thing. He thought calling the police proved his point. Meanwhile, other neighbors peeked through their curtains, watching quietly. Some shook their heads in disappointment, realizing Marcus and Alicia were being treated unfairly. Others stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. For Marcus and Alicia, the joy of their new home now carried a shadow. They had been polite, they had shown respect, and yet they were still seen with suspicion by a man who refused to understand them. But they stood strong, answering calmly, not letting fear or anger take over. It was only the beginning of a story that would soon reveal a truth Thompson never expected, a truth that would leave him shocked and the whole neighborhood speechless. Marcus stood outside, still holding his ID card, as the police officers carefully checked it under the beam of their flashlights. His heart was heavy. He had worked his whole life to earn respect, to provide for his wife, and to buy this house. Now, in front of his own home, he felt as if all of that meant nothing. He glanced back at Alicia, who was standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Sir, we just need to confirm everything," one officer said in a firm but neutral voice. Marcus nodded. "Of course. I understand. This is my home, and that's my wife inside. We just moved here recently. Tonight, I was unloading furniture after work." His voice was calm, steady, but deep down he was hurting. He knew exactly why this was happening. The officers looked at each other. One of them asked, "Do you have proof of purchase for the house? Maybe a document with your name and address?" Marcus sighed softly. He didn't want to make things worse. "Yes, I'll get it," he said, stepping back inside. Alicia followed him quickly and whispered, "Why is this happening? You didn't do anything wrong." Marcus looked at her with sad eyes and replied, "Because someone decided we don't belong here." He pulled out a folder from a drawer in the living room. Inside was the deed to the house, the official papers they had signed just a few weeks ago. He walked back outside and handed the papers to the officer. The officer studied them under the flashlight. Everything was correct. The address matched. Marcus's name was right there on the document. Still, the tension did not fade immediately. The other officer turned to Alicia. "Ma'am, can we also see your identification?" She stepped forward and handed over her ID card. She remained calm, though inside she felt a storm of emotions. She had always been careful about keeping her identity private in her neighborhood. She wanted to live a normal, simple life without drawing attention to herself. But now, standing in front of flashing lights, she had no choice. Meanwhile, across the street, Thompson leaned against his porch railing with a smirk on his face. He whispered to himself, "Finally, someone's dealing with them. They think they can just move in here and do whatever they want. Not in my neighborhood." He truly believed he was right, completely blind to his own prejudice. Other neighbors peeked through curtains, trying not to be seen. Some felt guilty for not speaking up earlier when Thompson made rude comments about Marcus and Alicia. Others were simply curious, drawn to the drama of police cars and flashing lights. The quiet street was alive with whispers and shadows. The officers returned the documents to Marcus and Alicia. "Everything seems to check out," one of them said. "We apologize for the inconvenience. But we did receive a call, so we had to come." Marcus gave a small, tired smile. "I understand. You're just doing your job. But I hope you see that we are not doing anything wrong." His words were respectful, yet they carried a quiet strength. Alicia, however, looked straight at the officers with steady eyes. "Can I ask who called you?" she said firmly. The officers exchanged a quick glance but didn't answer. "We can't disclose that, ma'am," one replied. But Marcus already knew. He turned his head slowly toward Thompson's porch. Even in the dim light, he could see Thompson's smug expression. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Marcus felt a sharp wave of frustration, but he held it in. One of the officers shifted his flashlight away and said, "Is everything okay now? Do you both feel safe tonight?" Alicia took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, we are fine. Thank you for checking." The officers nodded back and prepared to leave. As they walked back to their car, Thompson raised his voice. "You're just going to leave? Are you sure they belong here? Did you check everything?" His tone was filled with arrogance. The officers turned to him sharply. "Sir, we've seen enough. They live here. Everything is in order. Please go back inside your home." That response surprised Thompson. He wasn't expecting the officers to defend Marcus and Alicia. He stammered, but I know what I saw. They were moving things at night." One officer shook his head. "That's not a crime, sir. People move furniture at all hours. There's no problem here." The smug smile faded from Thompson's face. He turned red with anger, but the officers ignored him. They got back into their cars, the flashing lights fading as the engines started. The street slowly returned to quiet, but the tension remained heavy in the air. Marcus turned to Alicia. "Let's go inside," he said softly. She nodded and held his arm tightly. They closed the door behind them, but neither of them felt at peace. Alicia sat down on the couch, her hands trembling slightly. Marcus placed a hand over hers. "We can't let this break us," he whispered. Inside, Alicia's mind was racing. She thought about how hard they had worked to reach this point. She thought about how excited they had been to move into this home. And now, after only a few weeks, they had police officers standing in their yard because of one man's prejudice. She leaned her head on Marcus's shoulder. "I wanted this place to feel safe," she said softly. Marcus kissed her forehead and replied, "It will. We just have to be stronger than this." His words were filled with determination, though he himself was still shaken. Back across the street, Thompson paced on his porch. He was not satisfied. His plan had failed, but in his mind, he was convinced he had been right all along. "Something's not normal about them," he muttered. "I'll find out what it is." His heart was filled with stubbornness, not realizing that the truth he was about to discover would turn his world upside down. The next day, whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors quietly asked Marcus and Alicia if they were okay. Others avoided the topic, too uncomfortable to face the reality of what had happened. But the story of the flashing lights, the police cars, and the tense standoff at night was already the main subject of conversation. Alicia put on a brave face at work the next morning, but inside, she was tired of pretending. She had chosen to live quietly, without revealing her profession to her neighbors. She wanted people to see her as just Alicia, a wife, a homeowner, a neighbor. Not as someone with authority or a title. But now, she realized that sooner or later, the truth might have to come out. For now, she and Marcus kept going with their daily lives. They smiled when they walked out the door, waved when people passed by, and tried to live as normally as they could. But beneath their calm surface, both knew things were far from normal. And in the back of her mind, Alicia sensed that the incident was not over. She knew Thompson's eyes were still on them. She knew he wasn't done. And she knew that the next time, the truth about who she really was might not stay hidden any longer. The night's events had set the stage for something bigger, something that would shock not only Thompson but the entire neighborhood. Marcus and Alicia tried to push the incident behind them, but the memory of the flashing police lights still lived in their minds. For days, every time Marcus pulled into the driveway after work, he noticed Thompson watching from his porch. The man had the same suspicious stare, arms folded, eyes full of judgment. Alicia pretended not to see him when she watered the flowers in the front yard, but she could feel his gaze like a heavy weight on her shoulders. One Saturday morning, Marcus decided to fix a few things in the garage. He was moving boxes and hanging tools when he noticed a police car driving slowly down the street. His heart sank for a moment. "Not again," he whispered under his breath. But the car kept moving and turned the corner. Still, the fear had returned. It was like a scar that reminded him that no matter how much he smiled or waved, one phone call could bring suspicion back to his doorstep. Inside the house, Alicia was quietly reading legal papers at the kitchen table. She always did her work at home in private, never wanting her neighbors to know what she really did for a living. She was respected in the county courthouse, known for her fairness, wisdom, and calm authority. But here, on this street, she wanted to be just Alicia, the neighbor who loved gardening, the wife who cooked Sunday dinners. She wanted a simple life. She knew if people discovered who she was, everything would change. But after the incident, she began to wonder if hiding her true role was still possible. That evening, Marcus suggested they invite a couple of friends over for dinner. He wanted to bring some joy back into their home. "We can't live in fear," he said gently. "Let's enjoy our lives like we always planned." Alicia agreed, though she knew Thompson would probably find something to complain about. As the friends arrived and laughter filled the house, Thompson once again sat on his porch, narrowing his eyes. He muttered angrily, "They're up to something again. Always people coming in and out." His frustration grew, and soon his thoughts turned dark. He convinced himself that Marcus and Alicia were not who they claimed to be. He decided to call the police again, this time demanding they check everything more carefully. When the officers arrived, the laughter inside the house faded. Marcus opened the door and sighed deeply when he saw them. "Not again," he said quietly. The officers explained they had received another call. Marcus remained calm, though his heart ached with exhaustion. "You can come inside," he said, trying to avoid trouble. The officers stepped in, their flashlights sweeping across the living room. They saw a table set with dinner, glasses half full, and friends sitting quietly, shocked by the scene. Marcus handed them his ID again. "We've already shown all of this before," he said gently. "We live here. We own this house." Thompson had followed the officers halfway and now stood in the yard, shouting, "Check them properly. They're lying. I know it. They're not supposed to be here." His voice carried across the street. Neighbors came to their windows again, curious and concerned. This time, the officers turned to Alicia and asked firmly, "Ma'am, May we see your identification as well? Alicia glanced at Marcus. He gave a small nod. She walked calmly to her purse, pulled out her ID card, and handed it to the officer. He shined his flashlight on it, and his eyes widened slightly. He looked again, then looked at her with a different expression, one of respect. The second officer leaned closer to see. The name on the card was familiar. He whispered to his partner, "Is this?" The first officer nodded slowly. Both officers now stood straighter, their tone softening immediately. "Thank you, ma'am," one of them said. "We recognize your name. Everything is in perfect order here." Alicia stood tall and calm, but inside she felt a wave of mixed emotions. She never wanted her identity revealed in this way. She wanted her neighbors to see her as a person first, not as someone with authority. Yet, the moment had arrived. She couldn't hide forever. Thompson, however, was confused. "What's going on? Did you find anything? Why are you suddenly treating her differently?" he demanded, stepping closer. The officers turned to him with serious faces. "Sir, you need to step back. This family belongs here. There is no problem." But Thompson would not let go. "No. I don't believe it. Who are they? What's so special about her?" His voice echoed through the street. His anger, fueled by his prejudice, had blinded him to the truth standing right in front of him. One officer looked back at Alicia, silently asking permission. She gave a small nod. The officer then turned to Thompson and spoke firmly, "Sir, this woman is not only a homeowner here. She is Judge Alicia Carter, one of the most respected judges in this county. You've been calling the police on a sitting judge in her own yard." The words hit Thompson like a thunderclap. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He staggered back slightly, his face turning pale. Neighbors who had gathered at their windows gasped. Some whispered loudly, "Did he say judge? She's a judge." The news spread across the street like wildfire. Marcus stood beside his wife, holding her hand. He had always been proud of her, but tonight, in front of flashing lights and stunned neighbors, he felt that pride burn even brighter. She had stayed calm, dignified, and strong even when wrongly accused. Thompson, however, was left speechless. His arrogance, which had fueled his calls and complaints, now crumbled. He realized his prejudice had led him into humiliating himself in front of the whole neighborhood. The officers handed Alicia her ID back with respect. "Thank you, Your Honor," one of them said. The title made the neighbors whisper even louder. Thompson turned away, his face red with shame. For the first time, he felt small, exposed, and powerless. That night, the street carried a new silence. Not the silence of suspicion, but the silence of realization. Neighbors who had doubted Marcus and Alicia now saw them in a completely different light. Thompson returned to his house, closing his door quickly, while Marcus and Alicia stood side by side in their yard, strong and unshaken. The truth had finally begun to shine through, and the man who had caused them so much trouble was left to face the consequences of his own prejudice. The street was unusually quiet after the officers revealed the truth. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows now stood frozen, whispering to each other about what they had just heard. A respected judge living right among them. A woman they had seen watering flowers, waving politely, and carrying groceries. She was the very person they read about in local newspapers when important cases were decided. Alicia, standing tall in the dim glow of the streetlights, remained calm. She did not raise her voice or boast about her position. She simply looked at the officers and said, "Thank you for handling this matter." Her voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone used to speaking in court, yet gentle enough to remind everyone that she was still their neighbor. Marcus stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on hers. He felt relief, pride, and sadness all at once. Relief that the truth was finally out, pride in his wife's strength, and sadness that it had taken humiliation and false suspicion for people to see her differently. Thompson, on the other hand, was frozen in shock. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he pointed toward Alicia. She's a judge." His words were barely a whisper, but the neighbors heard them. The officer repeated firmly, "Yes, sir. Judge Alicia Carter. She is highly respected in this county. And you have been calling the police on her without reason." Those words felt heavier than bricks on Thompson's chest. He stumbled back toward his porch, gripping the railing for support. His arrogance, which once made him shout across the street with confidence, now melted into embarrassment. He wanted to disappear, to hide from the eyes of every neighbor who was staring at him with disbelief. One neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, stepped out of her house and walked toward Marcus and Alicia. She gave a small smile and said, "We are so sorry you had to go through this. You both deserve to feel welcome here." Others slowly followed, nodding in agreement, offering quiet apologies with their eyes. For years, Thompson had been loud in the neighborhood, always complaining, always pretending to know best. But now, no one sided with him. No one supported his words. Instead, people turned away from him, ashamed of the way he had treated Marcus and Alicia. The officers handed back Alicia's ID with respect. "Your Honor," one of them said softly, "please let us know if this continues. We will make sure you are not disturbed again." Alicia nodded. "Thank you, officers. I hope this will be the last time." The police cars drove off, their red and blue lights fading into the night. The crowd of neighbors slowly disappeared into their homes, whispering about the shocking discovery. Some were embarrassed they hadn't spoken up earlier when Thompson made rude remarks. Others promised themselves they would treat Marcus and Alicia differently from now on. As the street grew quiet, Thompson remained on his porch, still stunned. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The very woman he had judged without knowing, the woman he had called the police on, was someone with more respect, influence, and authority than he could ever imagine. Inside their home, Marcus sat with Alicia on the couch. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly, though her eyes looked tired. "I'll be fine. But I wanted to live here quietly. I didn't want my title to separate me from the neighbors. Now everyone knows." Marcus squeezed her hand. "They needed to know. Maybe now they'll respect us, not just because of your position, but because they'll realize how wrong they were." The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with talk. At the local coffee shop, people discussed the late-night police visit. "Did you hear? That woman is a judge," one man said in awe. "And Thompson called the police on her. Can you believe it?" Some neighbors came by Marcus and Alicia's house with small gifts, flowers, baskets of fruit, or just warm greetings. "Welcome to the neighborhood," they said sincerely, trying to make up for their silence earlier. Alicia accepted their kindness graciously, though she knew their sudden friendliness came from guilt. Thompson, however, hid inside his house. He avoided eye contact with everyone. For the first time, he felt the sting of being the outcast. He could hear the whispers around him. People who once nodded politely to him now turned away. His pride, which once gave him power in the neighborhood, had been crushed by his own actions. A week later, Marcus was mowing the lawn when Thompson finally gathered the courage to walk across the street. His steps were slow, his face heavy with shame. "Marcus," he said quietly, I didn't know. I didn't know who your wife was. I didn't mean to." His words trailed off. Marcus looked at him calmly. "You didn't need to know who she was," he replied firmly. "We deserved respect from the start, just like any other family here. Not because she's a judge, but because we're people. Neighbors. You didn't see that." Thompson lowered his head, unable to argue. He mumbled a weak, "I'm sorry," before walking back to his porch. Marcus didn't shout at him or return his bitterness. Instead, he turned back to his lawn, determined not to let Thompson's prejudice control their happiness anymore. That evening, Alicia stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked Marcus. He wrapped his arm around her and said, "Maybe not for him. But for the rest of the neighborhood? Yes. They saw the truth with their own eyes. They saw who we are. And they saw who he is." The days that followed brought a new atmosphere to the street. Children waved happily when Marcus and Alicia passed by. Neighbors invited them to gatherings. For the first time since moving in, Marcus and Alicia felt the warmth they had been waiting for. But Thompson's world grew smaller. The man who once shouted the loudest was now silent. His arrogance had been replaced by quiet regret. He realized that in trying to humiliate his neighbors, he had only humiliated himself. The revelation had turned the tables completely. The couple he had judged became the most respected people on the street. And he, the man who had called the police out of suspicion and prejudice, was now left alone with his shame. For Marcus and Alicia, the moment of truth had not only cleared their names but had also taught the entire neighborhood a powerful lesson about respect, dignity, and the danger of judging people without knowing their story. The weeks after the late-night incident slowly brought change to the quiet neighborhood. For Marcus and Alicia, life began to settle, though the memory of flashing police lights outside their home was not something they could easily forget. Every morning when Marcus watered the lawn, he noticed people greeting him more warmly than before. Neighbors who once offered only a polite nod now stopped for small conversations, asking how he and Alicia were doing. Some even admitted that they felt ashamed for staying silent when Thompson spread his suspicion. Alicia, who had always wanted to live quietly without anyone knowing her title, now found that the truth had made its way into every corner of the street. Children whispered excitedly when they saw her, saying, "That's the judge." Parents encouraged their kids to wave at her. Some neighbors even came to her door with baked goods or flowers, saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood properly this time." Alicia accepted everything with grace, thanking them for their kindness, but inside she wished it had not taken such an unpleasant event for people to treat them as equals. Meanwhile, Thompson lived in silence. The man who once sat proudly on his porch, ready to complain about anything and everything, now avoided everyone's eyes. He stopped going to neighborhood gatherings, stopped chatting with people on the street, and even changed his walking route so he wouldn't have to cross paths with Marcus or Alicia. The very people he had tried to humiliate now carried respect, while he carried only regret. One evening, Marcus was sitting on the porch with Alicia, sipping tea as the sun went down. The air was calm, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. "You know," he said softly, "when we first moved here, I thought it would take time to build trust. I never imagined it would come this way." Alicia nodded. "Sometimes truth comes out when we least expect it. I didn't want anyone to know who I was. I wanted them to see me as a neighbor, a friend. But maybe this was meant to happen. Maybe it was the only way for people to see through the lies and prejudice." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "And they did. They saw it with their own eyes. They saw who you are, not just a judge, but someone strong, calm, and kind." Their conversation was interrupted by a hesitant figure walking across the street. It was Thompson. His shoulders were slumped, his steps slow, and his face carried the weight of shame. For days, he had been wrestling with himself, trying to decide whether to apologize again or simply remain silent forever. Tonight, he had chosen to try. "Judge Carter," he began awkwardly, I wanted to say I'm sorry." His voice was shaky, far from the loud, confident tone he once used when shouting accusations. "I was wrong. I judged you without knowing you. I caused trouble for you and your husband, and I regret it. Alicia looked at him steadily. Her eyes were calm, but they carried the quiet strength of someone who had been through much more than just neighborhood suspicion. Mr. Thompson, she said softly, it wasn't about who I am or what title I carry. It was about respect. You didn't give us that. Every person deserves it, no matter their position. Thompson lowered his head. I know, he muttered. I let my thoughts, my ignorance, guide me. And I paid the price. Everyone sees me differently now. I don't blame them. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to hear it from me. Marcus leaned forward, his tone firm but not harsh. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about learning from it. We don't want to live in anger, and we don't want you to either. But understand this: your actions didn't just hurt us. They showed the whole neighborhood what happens when someone judges without reason. Thompson nodded slowly. His eyes were moist, though he quickly blinked them dry. I'll live with that, he whispered, before turning back toward his house. After he left, Alicia sat quietly for a while. Finally, she said, do you think he'll change? Marcus sighed. Maybe. Maybe not. But at least now he knows. And maybe that knowledge will stop him from treating someone else the same way. In the days that followed, Marcus and Alicia became symbols of quiet strength in their community. Not because of Alicia's title, but because of how they carried themselves with dignity, patience, and kindness, even in the face of unfair treatment. Their story spread beyond the neighborhood. Some local news outlets even covered the incident, praising Alicia for her calm response and Marcus for his steady composure. The story became an example of how truth eventually rises, even when covered by suspicion and prejudice. At the courthouse, Alicia continued her work with the same fairness she had always shown. Yet now, when people saw her name, they also remembered the story of how she and her husband had been treated in their own neighborhood and how they responded with grace. Colleagues admired her even more, not only as a judge but as a woman who stood with quiet courage. Back in the neighborhood, things gradually changed for the better. The couple was no longer seen as outsiders. Neighbors invited them to picnics, community meetings, and small gatherings. Children often came by to say hello, and parents thanked Alicia and Marcus for being role models. It was as if the community had collectively learned a lesson they would never forget. Thompson, however, remained in the background. Though he had apologized once, he never fully regained the trust or respect of his neighbors. His porch, once the place where he sat with a sense of superiority, now felt like a corner of shame. He rarely came out, and when he did, he kept his head down. For Marcus and Alicia, forgiveness did not mean forgetting. They knew the scars of that night would always remain. But they chose to move forward, to live with joy and dignity. They often reminded themselves that their story was not just about pain, it was also about strength, truth, and the power of patience. One quiet night, as Marcus and Alicia sat on their porch under the stars, Marcus whispered, "We've been through so much, but we're still standing. That's what matters." Alicia smiled softly and replied, "Yes. And maybe our story will remind others to think before they judge. To choose kindness over suspicion." The two held hands in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them, their hearts filled with hope. The neighborhood had changed. Their lives had changed. And though the memory of prejudice would never completely vanish, it was no longer the ending of their story. It was the beginning of something better, an example of how dignity and truth can transform even the darkest moments into lessons of light.